Good morning, Graeme.
Good morning, Doru.
Good to see you once again. It's such a pleasure. I don't know how the weather looks like in New Zealand. I see there's some sun behind you, isn't it?
At present.
At present, yeah. So
But
yeah,
it turns to custard later.
Okay. So yeah, for the time being, there's sun here too. Okay, so some of the viewers, I assume, are already familiar with our previous conversation, and even more recently, we had another go at your paper presented for AIOCS 2023, the big conference a couple of weeks ago. The fortunate circumstance for me that the original video was lost, and we did it again with my being your audience, and it has been such a privilege and an enjoyment to talk to you again. And this triggered this new conversation, the idea for this conversation. And I won't be giving to the viewers more links to your prodigious activity. They already know it from our previous conversation. And anyway, they are annoyed with my author profiles and all that. But what I'll do is to lay out a bit of context for this conversation. First of all, Dr. Graeme Finlay is one of the most important authors so far published in CIPOSAT, the relaunched AIOCS journal, Christian Perspectives on Science and Technology. Efforts have been undertaken since 2020, I think, to relaunch this journal that existed for a couple of decades and then disappeared for some reason. And now we have it. Do you see? Now everyone can see the website. We have it relaunched as an open access world standard journal. For those who haven't seen it yet, the first full issue can be accessed. So download PDF. You get the whole full issue, 200 and plus pages, or the individual articles and book reviews. Yeah, so it's all there, all here. Yeah, make it bigger so that people can read. But this is just a pretext for showing something else. Graeme published in the first edition of the relaunched journal the article Evolution as History, Phylogenetics of Genomes and Manuscripts, which was really a mind-blowing article from my viewpoint, pursuing the topic of evolution as history, and also how manuscripts, biblical manuscripts for that matter, show a kind of evolution of the text. And Graeme noticed the many symmetries between this kind of these two histories. Well, the image is chosen by the webmaster. The article can be read here as a web page, but also it can be downloaded in the regular journal format. No images there apart from Graeme's figures. And earlier this year, he published a second article, I think growing out of the previous one, being and becoming the complementarity of creation and evolution. So this is the second edition of the relaunched journal. Again, the article can be read in both formats on the website as web page, but also it can be downloaded as PDF with pagination and all that, and can be used, for scholarly purposes, if not only out of sheer personal interest. But why am I mentioning this? It's because just recently, I had the privilege of reading another article, the third article in this series by Graeme, which went through the usual throes of peer review, double-blind peer review, and the article is now accepted. We are looking forward to have it published soon. And this one, for the time being, as a Word document on my computer, it's called Bornavirus Genes in the Human Genome, Bringing the New from the Old. So they all these articles, this trilogy, if you like, addresses the topic of evolution with a special focus on genetics, genomes, with variations and all that. But from a Christian viewpoint, and this is very interesting from my viewpoint, because, growing up, I think this is a story that we all hear all too often. Growing up, we hear so many conflicting stories. Well, I'm a believer, therefore I cannot believe in evolution, because evolution is by definition atheistic, despises God, rejects God, and so on and so forth, and is therefore counterproductive for the formation, the life, the career of a Christian. And of course, from the other angle, you can't be a scientist or training to become a scientist and embrace mythology, creation, providence, God writing things to us, letters to us, and then promising some kind of bright future at the eschaton. Well, Graeme actually grapples with all these things, and he does so cogently, elegantly, and I might add, with satisfaction from the viewpoint of one like me that has no idea whatsoever of genetics and biology, that it's legible. You can read what?
You're very kind.
You can read and understand what Graeme has to say. And now that I use the two buzzwords, read and understand, I'll return to this, or to these two words, which, by the way, are inspired by a conversation between our Lord Jesus by his colonial name, Yeshua by his own name, our Savior, with one of those scribes, grammarians, sages of the Old Testament, who did not know who his neighbor was. And the Lord replied, well, what do you read and how do you read it, or something? What's written and how do you read it? How do you understand it? And I believe that this is a good topic, at least when it comes to Graeme's idea, even recently presented at the AIOCS conference, the Primal Testament. There's something written within our genome. So now I think if the viewers look at Graeme's face, realize that we haven't prepared this meeting, and therefore we might expect interesting stuff to occur. Okay, so what's written in our genes? And how do we understand it as Christians in this case, or perhaps scientists in your case, theologians, perhaps in my case? Well, you have double training, so you are both. What's written? How do we read it? Would you care to comment on what's written first? What do we find when we grapple with the mysteries of our genome? All these bits and pieces that are part and parcel of our genetic makeup. What do they say about us, Graeme?
Well, the genome is commonly called an instruction book. because in the context of our environment, it directs our formation and our body shape, and it affects our personality, how long we'll live, obviously in the context of environment. So in that, it's a remarkable thing. I found a picture on the internet not long ago of a research group in Britain which had printed out the genome. And it's 3 billion letters. And that's one set. We've got 2 sets in each cell, so 6 billion letters. And they had a pile of books, 23 large volumes, 4-point font, which was several fold, several meters if you were to stack all the books on top of each other. So it is an amazing text. I'm not a molecular geneticist. I can't really scroll through the genome because I don't have the computer skills. It's an amazing text which can fill your life and your days. But it's also a history book because it has a record of its own construction. This amazingly dense repository of information includes within itself how it was put together. And to me, as a Christian, our Bible is a demonstration of how God acts in history. We cannot separate theology from history. And people like Tom Wright are very strong on this, but it's a general thing which I'm sure our top theologians would accept, that we cannot separate theology from history. And when I look at the incredible history in this amazing book, which we carry in our genome, you can do the science on a drop of saliva or a bit of hair on your shoulders. It's there to be analyzed. And as a Christian, I look at this book and say, if I am God's creation, which I believe I am, then the book which is in my genome bears some sort of authority. It's not normative in the sense of I must love my neighbor, but it nevertheless bears some authority as far as my physical provenance is concerned. And that's why I have suggested we consider it to be a primal testament. And one other comment I'll just make. My father told me very early in my life, Graham, the New Testament interprets the Old. And I would suggest that our biblical testaments help us interpret how we look at our genome. You can interpret it as an atheist if you want. It's just a totally random mess, which happens to have got to where we are. But as a Christian, I believe that when we look through the eyes of biblical faith, the faith revealed in Jesus, then we can draw lesson from our genome as well.
So much already. But I'll address the end of what you just said. So we can read a genome, those 27 volumes, from a variety of viewpoints. We can read them as believers or unbelievers, or perhaps as artists or philosophers, scientists, theologians, and so on and so forth, or tradespeople. Yeah. Okay. So there are various ways in which we can read the book, which is quite interesting because any book can be read that way, including our Holy Scriptures. We call them scriptures, but in many university departments of biblical studies, they are not read through the lens of faith. They are studied as any other piece of literature, and one does not require to be a believer to study the scriptures in depth, and read those more than 27 volumes. Yeah.
Oh, actually 23. Did I say 27?
Sorry, maybe. No, you said 23. Sorry, it's just my. Yeah, I have to pump more.
Yes, have some more coffee.
wake up, wake up. Okay. So those 23 volumes, you know, and our whatever 2 written testaments, you know, have more than that. But the idea is that you have a text, whether you put inverted commas or not, you have a text, either our genome or the scriptures, and you have interpretation possibilities to interpret, to read that text that do not have to overlap, do not have to coincide, and perhaps this is why it's so important to remember, from time to time at least, that early Christian scriptural interpretation grew out of rabbinic interpretation, Second Temple Judaism, where actually they have realized that within the same text, or the same text can accommodate a range of readings, of interpretations, which do not require bridging. They are just there. Yeah, I remember reading long ago in the Hasidic stories of Martin Buber. You know, it's a good thing, summary, whatever, historical summary to early Hasidism. And there was this story with, I think, 2 or 3 tzaddikim, those wise people who competed in terms of who gets to the highest level of scriptural meaning first. And they realized that it's impossible, or even if you get to a certain level of meaning, you don't have access to others. So what's the highest level? What's the lowest level? Well, it's nothing. It's just some kind of summary or schematic representation of those meanings. Otherwise, you have access to this meaning, I have access to that meaning, he or she has access to those other meanings. And that's the highest for us. So the text is there, but this doesn't mean that we all understand the same. Would you reckon that when it comes to either the scriptures or the 23 volumes of genomic literature, the Primal Testament, as you call it so beautifully, is it always the same kind of hermeneutical question? What's written? How do you read?
Yes, I would think so. I mean, as you've been speaking, clearly we do want to understand the scriptures, but I think God can use what we would consider a faulty interpretation. For example, I've been reading Tom Wright again recently, and the Dikaiosune Theo, which Martin Luther understood as God's gift of righteous standing before him. And obviously it was part of the Reformation. It was a great blessing. But Tom Wright says, no, that's not right. The Dikaiosune Theo is God's own righteousness, his faithfulness to the covenant. And he didn't dispute Martin Luther's theology, but he did say we don't actually get to the imputation of righteousness from that term. So God can still use what we may consider inadequate interpretations. But as a Christian, look at the genome. In fact, I've noted 7 things down. Can I just very quickly go through them, where I, as a Christian, would see things which would differ from someone who interprets the genome from an atheistic perspective. The first thing I think is that the genome does have the authority that as Christians we must accept it's a history, that we are an evolved species, to be obedient to the data, to be obedient to the text. We acknowledge we are evolved. This is the way God's produced us. The second thing is our genome is a typically hominoid genome. It's a typically ape genome. If you looked at the base sequences, you wouldn't think that we can write music or do mathematics, or some people can do mathematics. So it takes away hubris. We can't say to God, I'm special. Rather, everything we have is a gift. So there's no hubris. The third thing, I think, is we look at the genome through eyes of Christianity, and we can see that we have weaknesses embedded in our DNA. And it needs to make us compassionate. I remember once years ago being at a seminar talking about genetic disease. And somebody said, well, why don't we just abort all the heterozygotes, all the carriers? And the answer was, if you did that, we'd all be aborted. You know, we are all weak. And so we need to show compassion to those who are born with different handicaps and maybe personality traits, which are partly genome inherited. So compassion. The third one, I think the vulnerability of the genome calls us to wise living. You know, smoking, or some of these modern lifestyle things which contribute towards metabolic disease, which can chemically damage genome. So it's a gift of God to us, but it does require us to treat our bodies as a temple of the Holy Spirit. So it's wise living. The fifth thing is, as John Polkinghorne says, God works patiently. We are the product of billions of years. And it's not appropriate to say, you know, there's this long, meandering, meaningless history. He just says, hey, God works patiently. And it brings us back to this biblical value of patience in our own lives. You know, things don't happen immediately. The process of sanctification is very slow. I get frustrated at myself, how slow it is. But almost there. The sixth thing is, I think it helps us understand the value of providence. You mentioned providence earlier. As Christians, we easily say, oh, nothing happens by accident. But I think randomness does occur. The genome is witness to that. The same mutations which give us new capacities in history can also cause cancer. So God has given freedom to God's creation. I think that's a clear message from our genome. He has also given order and consistency so that when we are in his hands, he will lead us into the future that he has for us, even though so much is happenstance. Yet God is in control and will take history to its final destination. And the last thing I would say is, when you look at the genome, history is particularistic. There are particular events. Now, philosophers, I believe the ancient Greeks and more philosophers of modern times, grand principles. But for us, history is particularistic. It is the death of a Hebrew peasant 2,000 years ago, which is the linchpin upon which all history depends. I think history is particularistic. God works in very particular ways. The death and resurrection of Jesus are two discrete events, and our genome is full of them as well. So I'm not interested in great principles that you can work out in philosophy class, but the particularities of history are very precious.
And so this is roughly put your summary of what a careful reader will find in those 23 volumes?
That's my perspective as a Christian. When I read it, when my mind is formed by God's action in biblical history, then I look at the genome and say, hey, why don't we learn these lessons? Call it eisegesis if you like, but it's biblically based eisegesis of the genome, which I hope also has a little bit of exegesis into it as well. This is the way God works in his creation.
Well, yeah, the exegetical exercise approach, has to do with the identification of the letters, the 23 volumes of letters written within our genome, so that's the exegetical work, on our nature, and they have established the critical edition.
Yeah.
23. Look, I gladly put myself in your framework because it's so profitable. So they actually, scientists have done the exegetical part of this work, which they usually do. You know, even in biblical scholarship, academic biblical studies, you know, this is what they do. They do exegesis in this modern understanding of the word. They bring out the building blocks of the biblical, what they call it, biblical literature, material, yeah?
It's the textual criticism, which is just a rigorous science.
Yeah, rigorous science. So these people with the Genome Project have undertaken the exegetical work. They published the critical edition of our genome, and now comes the reading part. And as it happens, you in those by way of those 7 points, you summarize those 23 huge volumes from the viewpoint of your double, let's call it, not only expertise, location in life, placement in life as a scientist and a Christian, which is amazing. I mean, this way of reading is particularly yours. I have never thought of reading the Primal Testament of the genome in this way, honestly. So it's a refreshing view what I get from you. But this doesn't mean that, for example, one that doesn't have your double expertise cannot undertake the same kind of interpretation. Call it eisegesis, as you said. But it becomes my own way of making sense of it. As with Jesus and that scribe, tell me what's written, and this is the work done by the people who compiled the, how many meters? 7 meters of
several. I'm not quite sure, but yeah,
several,
quite a few piles, you know, this far off the floor.
Okay, what's written, and they have done the job of establishing the critical edition, inverted commas, of our genome, and now many readings are possible. Yours, mine, theirs, whatever, you know. And the idea is, we should realize that we are readers of a critical text. The critical text is not in question. What might be questioned is the validity of my interpretation versus your interpretation versus theirs or theirs. But this places the whole discussion in such a, you know, generous and also rigorous setting, which shows that there is something that we hold in common, the 23 volumes of genetic text, you know, and that's not something that can be negotiated. Perhaps tomorrow scientists will add some other volumes of appendices, fine, or indexes or whatever, bibliographies, I don't know, yeah, to use the metaphor further, you know, but that's their job. And now it comes, you know, this view of a Christian, this view of a Christian who's also a scientist, this view of non-Christian believer, this view of someone who has no convictions of a spiritual sort or religious or philosophical sort, and so on and so forth. And we all come up with our own ways of reading, or reading ourselves into, rather, the text. Which doesn't mean that we are not right. It just means that's my way of reading. His or her way of reading might be different or might be like mine. But the thing is, we are all readers. And this is something that perhaps most people today who are so in a rush to cancel each other don't realize. There are ways in which we can read, but this doesn't mean that the text isn't there and that the text was not established critically by way of rigorous science. This is such a liberating thing. You know, I think many believers resist whatever they construe as science because they confuse the text and the interpretation. What's written? How do you read? Because of this confusion, many believers live with this kind of, I don't know, not confess, perhaps not even realized complex of inferiority. And they simply say, well, my faith allows me to, or dictates to me, to reject the 23 volumes of genetic text. Vice versa, out of the same kind of confusion between text and interpretation, what's written, how do you read? You know, non-believers say, well, Christianity or any kind of philosophy or religion or spirituality, all this is mythology that should be discarded because we are now enlightened. We have the 23 volumes, but the 23 volumes still require reading. And that's the thing. And you have presented under those 7 points, you have presented your way of reading, which is such a beautiful, enriching reading, I might say, because it takes for granted the text. The genome has authority and we need to be obedient. Well, that's who we are. Well, you can't say because it's written we are made out of the dust of the earth that we can ignore the 23 volumes that show what that dust means. Yeah. And then comes the rest of the stuff. Don't expect too much from the text. Perhaps I should make another scriptural parallel here, because there are people who read themselves into the scriptures and make the scriptures sing a song that it's not theirs. The so-called creation science or whatever, various avatars of that kind of stuff, you know. And you transform the scriptures into something that the scriptures aren't supposed to be. The scriptures led Graeme, the scientist, to a certain reading of the 23 volumes of genetic or genomic text, you know, and the same wisdom can guide all of us to read that scientific text or any other scientific text in ways that are God-inspired, wisdom-informed, and grounded in our quest for spiritual transformation. Or you can take another lens and read the same 23 volumes from a different angle, and then the result will be perhaps different. But the text is there.
And I think the text, I mean, as a Christian, I find it very satisfying because it's our whole life understanding, our whole worldview, which leads us to read the text in a certain way. And clearly, to me, as a follower of Jesus, it is the Christian worldview, the Judeo-Christian worldview, especially with the Messiah Jesus and his work, which gives me the spectacles behind the eyes. No, Richard Dawkins is quite welcome to read the genetic text as nothing but matter, nothing but chemistry. But the thing is, he doesn't live like that. He is a person. So he claims to read it wisely, but he ignores the possibility that the whole complex of our personhood points to other dimensions which affect our reading of the text.
So the 23 volumes do not actually exhaust the mystery of the human person. They perhaps map human nature. So perhaps this would be a distinction we need at this juncture between nature and person. And the 23 volumes of genetic literature tell us what we are, what our whatever biological makeup is, and how, because it's a history, how we arrived at this point in history where we are at, but this doesn't exhaust the mystery of the person, including Dawkins's,
absolutely,
which is irreducible to that kind of text. And therefore, the task of the person is to make sense of that genetic material in a very unique way. Is this what you say?
Absolutely right. I mean, I've thought about this and I've written on it too. Our genetics are just what we can be potentially. We become human through relationship. It is our mothers, our parents, our siblings, our society's personal input, which takes a human animal and changes it into a human being. And people forget this. They forget it. They speak of our genome as forming our mind. Look, do this thought experiment. If you put a baby on a desert island, or even a group of babies, and fed them and let them just be, how would they grow up? They would not learn language. Their minds would not develop. They could not think. They could not think humanly without the input of those who are human before them.
They become another species.
They will just be a species. To me, if that thought experiment, if you put a baby on a desert island, would you lose 200,000 years of culture in one step? To me, my understanding is that our humanity, our ability to love and know, even our sense of mentalization, our theory of mind, we are taught that. And one very effective lesson I once learned: when we are babies, we do not learn a language. That language forms our mind. So, and this, when Jesus said, eternal life is knowing you, the only true God, human life is knowing. Of course, it runs on a genetic basis. But the acquisition of humanity is taught through relationship. I find this immensely significant in a spiritual sense.
Wow. And this shows that, on the one hand, I'm trying to translate for myself what you said. From a certain viewpoint, we have the genetic text written within our nature, which somehow has prepared us for becoming what we are.
Yes.
On the other hand, this natural becoming does not suffice to make us what we currently are. And what we currently are is not only this internal kind of process written within our genes, it also entails a certain context, a framework, relation with God, with the neighbor, with culture, environment, and so on and so forth. And this is what makes us, and we cannot reduce everything to the letters of the text.
No.
As Orthodox, I'm so happy to hear this, because, we Orthodox don't believe on the sola scriptura.
Sorry?
We don't believe in sola scriptura. The Bible itself requires a relational framework where it's read, applied, lived.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, well, sorry for my nastiness. But look, it's so important. So genetics is important in that it maps, and the 23 volumes make this obvious. Genetics maps our history as a species.
Yes.
And this is what we are. And instead of saying, well, we are made of stardust, well, I mean fairy dust.
Which we are, yes.
Yeah, we are stardust, not fairy
Yes.
dust. Okay. Or maybe we're also made of fairy dust, who knows? Yes. Okay. We are stardust, yeah. But instead of saying, I don't know, made out of thin air, yeah, or whatever other sublime elements, yeah, we are made of all this, and the dust of the earth we find in Genesis 2 is a beautiful metaphor of all this history, or this entire history. Now, Graeme, if that's the case, then is it allowed, from the viewpoint of that huge series of volumes, 23 volumes, is it possible to read Genesis 2, the story of paradise, as illustrating a crucial event, or a particular event, no particularity, a particular event in the history of the species, where perhaps a couple, perhaps a group, reached the fulfillment of the human destiny? They have become more than dust of the earth. And in so doing, they show that whole history is fruitful. All that dust gathered within our genes, all those species, all that history of life, and the history of the cosmos, if we are stardust, yeah, written within our genes, leads to this point where, well, let's call it two people in a garden, all of a sudden wake up and see each other in a different light, because they have opened themselves to a kind of light that transcends physicality. Now, this means that what we read in the scriptures, again, one of those questions that perhaps we shouldn't ask, you know, do the scriptures tell us about the origins of humanity, the origins of life, even the origins of the cosmos? That kind of question contradicts all the scientific textbooks that tell us, at least in this case, 23 volumes tell us this is the history of life for us, leading to us. But if we look at Genesis 2 as a particular moment in that history, perhaps a culmination of that history, then we realize that the scriptures aren't about the history of life on earth. They are about the history of God's people on earth. Would this be a reading, a possible reading?
I think so, Doru. To me, and you really need to speak to, well, a theologian or an Old Testament scholar, but Genesis 2 to me is not physical anthropology. And so I don't want to try to link it to any particular persons at any particular time. It's theological anthropology. And so I in my own heart, I doubt whether it relates to a particular event. Tom Wright, again, coming back to Tom Wright, he says the story of the garden and the fall probably, well, it could well have been a commentary in story form of Israel's own history.
Well, there you have
Called, put in a beautiful country, sinned, driven out into the wilderness. So there are various ways of interpreting that. But for me, the closest I can get to a biological anthropology is to say that we have here a creature which has become intelligent. And it's also a creature which has moral failings. We are selfish.
Also the possibility of dignity and the possibility of through relationality, vertically and horizontally,
yes,
the possibility of overcoming all the dust.
That's right. So our sin, thinking back to the fall, our sin is this conjunction of willfulness, of having the intelligence to do wrong, plus perhaps our native weakness. So we are responsible for how we live, because that is who we now are. So this is where I see Genesis telling us about our theological anthropology. a creature gifted but in need of salvation. But I wouldn't try to link it too much to a creature gradually growing and then finding a crisis where it decides to go the wrong way.
Yeah,
I just don't understand, you know, where human volition, accountability before God, I don't know where these things come from. I think that's a question without answers. I mean, in my own history, when did I become a sinful creature responsible before God and in need of salvation? I don't know when that happened, because our own development is a continuum. So I don't try to imagine, but I know now I am a man of a sort, with weaknesses and sins for which I am responsible and for which I need redemption.
but
I need salvation.
Yeah, also a man with a promise of good things.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think more or less consciously, the two of us, and perhaps the viewers, depend a lot on our respective frameworks. For example, it happens that long time ago, when I worked in the Department of Systematic Theology in Bucharest, I worked a number of years in a row with a visiting professor from Switzerland who was a Reformed theologian.
Right.
Yeah, he visited our department, and we had very interesting interdisciplinary and interdenominational seminars. And I think I know something about, say, Calvinism more than other forms of Western Christianity through that kind of from that experience. And one of the things that I remember he was saying, Martin Hauser, his name. One of the things he was saying is, look, when I came here to Bucharest and I immersed myself in, for instance, the theology of the Romanian scholar Dumitru Stăniloae, I realized that there was a huge difference between his way of seeing the story of Adam and Eve and Karl Barth's. By the way, Stăniloae had always behind his in all of his photos from home. Behind his desk, there's the whole series of Barth's dogmatic theology.
Okay.
So that was a
source of
that was a source of inspiration for him, and he sort of conversed with Barth's theology time and again. But Stăniloae developed a different kind of approach to the story of Adam and Eve, and whereas in Barth, that story is mainly reduced to the fall, or emphasizes the topic of the fall, Stăniloae's approach emphasizes the paradise part, the chapter 2 of Genesis, not chapter 3 of Genesis. And this is perhaps where I should have explained why I brought this up, because from my viewpoint, what we read in Genesis is not reducible to the failure recorded in Genesis 3. It's also a moment of sublime achievement, where from the dust of the earth, which is Genesis 2:7 or so, you have, through a number of metaphors, depicted this condition of a human being or humanity or a group of humans that reach the destination. A form of existence, you mentioned existential aspects earlier, a form of existence that is, on the one hand, anchored grounded in the dust of the earth history. On the other hand, opens the doors and the windows, a house without roof, if you like, towards the divine horizon, and in that light are able to see each other as different from the simple dust. She is Isha because I am Ish, whatever that means. Yeah, all of a sudden, it's this realization that we can live differently. The fact that they could not withstand that kind of divine intensity of life, and they lost it, yes. And the Reformation reminded us, all of us, of the reality of our failures, from those people down to me, you and me, you know, because we all do the same, one way or the other. But there's still something inbuilt there, and I believe that one of the things that fascinates me is the fact that, at least the way I read The Dust of the Earth, as a beautiful metaphor of all that history behind us, a history that through random events used by the divine providence wisely towards guiding us there. The story tells us that history reaches some kind of fulfillment. It's perhaps the personal fulfillment of a group of people. And by the way, one of my favorite sources, Athanasius of Alexandria, doesn't speak of two people in paradise. He says the company of saints.
Okay.
Yeah. That's how he reads Genesis 2.
Right. Okay.
As long as Adam and Eve cultivated the company of the saints, they would have done well, but they haven't. So it's relation that helps them maintain a certain status of a transformed spiritual life, you know. When they abstract themselves, exclude themselves from the company of the saints, whatever that meant for Athanasius, they lost the plot, and they have become what we are. But my own ramblings or readings, if you like.
Sorry, I was the rambler. I took you off on a tangent, but I mean, can you say that biosis, the coming to do of biology, precedes theosis, being taken into the divine life?
Yeah, beautiful. And you know, sorry, you know, I'm the prisoner of my own framework. I do patristics for a living, and this is where I mainly draw my analogies. Gregory of Nyssa, 4th century, so a younger contemporary of Athanasius, has this book, whatever, variously translated as On the Making of the Human Being. Various other, even recently, Father John Bear in Edinburgh produced another translation and changed the title altogether. Anyway, so On the Making of the Human Being, and what's very interesting there, he begins on a very biological, physicalist note, describing all the elements that are part and parcel of our nature. And then he addresses the topic of being in the image of God, of virtue, sin, and so on and so forth. At least from the viewpoint of that treatise, I think that there's some kind of wisdom pronounced through that history of random events that turns things for the better. So someone, inverted commas, or put capital S, someone uses that history to lead us where we are, so that we can read, at some point, we can read the whole 23 volumes with the eyes of someone who knows God. Of course, this isn't what a scientist would say about all those 23 volumes, but I believe that between the two of us, being both Christians, this is something that is legitimate, really.
Some scientists do. Don't forget that the director of the Genome Project, Francis Collins,
True.
is a believer for whom the genome, I should have made an 8th point, the genome is a source of worship.
Wow. That's number 8?
Yeah, that's Francis Collins. I owe that to him, but you know, it induces him to worship. Well,
Saint Basil the Great would be happy to meet him one day.
You will, I'm sure.
Yeah, because he said in his homilies on the 6 days of creation,
Right.
he kept repeating this. Look at this blade of grass. Look at that flower. Look at that tree. Look at this.
Yeah.
They all invite you to contemplate and glorify the Maker.
Yes. Yes.
Source of worship. This is great.
Another little cliche I often use, you hear people say, huh, I'm not a glorified ape. But to me, that is a sublime wonder. It's the grace of God. I am a glorified ape, biologically an ape. In Christ, the point you're making, glorified. Share the likeness of Christ.
And yeah, sorry to interrupt you. In your article on born viruses and what they represent in terms of our genome, you actually say something like that, that this is the mystery, how all that apeness of ours, is brought to a point where it can be more than that, without denying what they are.
Yeah.
Can we say that we should learn how to read the 23 volumes of genomic text and then try to do something about ourselves, our lives better? I take you literally when you say that the genomic text is normative, and we should abide by, we should obey it.
Oh, there is normative aspect to it. We need to obey it.
Yeah.
We need to be faithful to its implications.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because God is the creator.
Yeah. And he uses the material, in creation, continuous creation. He uses this material that also bears the imprint of the earth, so to speak, of all the history of life.
Right.
Creation plus evolution, not either of them.
That's right. Yes.
And this leads us, on the one hand, to the realization of what we really are from this side of the fence, the product of an evolutionary history that includes apes and dust and mosquitoes or whatever else. Things better than I do. On the other hand, all this history ends, inverted commas, with me, with you, any of our viewers, who are supposed to learn something about ourselves, themselves, and also do something about their lives. You know what? Why is this important for me? Because at least in early modernity, where biology was so perhaps less impactful as it was, for example, the philosophical idea of an infinite universe. Upon the realization of an infinite universe, people drew immediately the conclusion that life is senseless and pointless.
Yeah.
To this day, I mean, there are many scientists who say, well, the universe is too vast for you and me to mean anything.
Yeah.
And I assume that from a certain viewpoint, this is what happens in New Atheism, and that, well, the genes are just genes, and don't read yourself into them because they have their own history, and that history doesn't concern you at all. Well, what if that history concerns me? And I'm supposed to both read and understand that history and also do something about my life. So the responsibility is still there. I can't just say, well, I read this text, then I go to die.
Right.
This is supposed to be a moment of illumination when I realize that all that history of life is written within me, compressed, summarized within my genes. But instead of being, I don't know, disheartened by what I read, I'm actually called to contemplate and glorify the wisdom of God, who gives me today this opportunity to understand and do something about it. This is deeply overwhelming.
Mm.
So I don't know. I don't know if I converse with you or I'm just lost in my own thoughts now.
No, these are valid. These are valid. I mean, Don Polking always used to say, science points beyond itself.
Points beyond itself. Yeah. And our lives mean more than the 23 volumes.
Yes, absolutely.
But they are there. They are part of us. We need to.
They're essential. Yeah, absolutely essential.
This is amazing. This is the most illuminating moment for me. I do, from time to time, science and religion, from time to time. This is a very illuminating point where, I see so clearly, because my perspective is not biological usually or genetic. I see how important it is to know more and more, to realize the grandeur, the sublimity of God's work within these circumstances of ours. Thank you very much, Graeme. This has been amazing.
Thank you, Doru. God bless you.